Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the 1992 U.S. Olympic card sets. So, 1992 is the first time we got actual trading cards of Olympics athletes in a traditional way, meaning in packs. Prior to that, it had never happened. We'd had some sets before. I mean, there were German cards from 1932 and 1936. You had the Brook Bond cards in the late 70s. And then in the 80s, there was a smattering of sets kind of all over the place that were mostly done as advertising sets. But in terms of a traditional in-pack set, we'd never had one prior to 1992 for the Olympics for a very specific reason, which is that the way that Olympics work is not conducive to sports trading cards. That's just, the two don't work together. See, in normal sports, you have an entire season. You have the preseason, you have the regular season, and you have the postseason. In the preseason, you're excited about the players who are going to have a great season. In the middle of the season, you're reevaluating as you're learning about players who you didn't know were very good, and there were players who you thought were good who are kind of fading off, so there's some dynamics to that. And then at the end of the season, you're all excited about who the best teams were and who the best players were. And so there's even a period after the season's over where people are still interested in sports cards, but that's for teams that we are personally invested in, and more importantly, that's for teams that are going to be playing just a few months later. The Olympics are different because they happen every 4 years, and so that means that when the Olympics are over, you've got 3.5 years where nothing's going to happen. Plus, it's not about our community team, it's about our nation, it's about pride. And so the way that the Olympic market works is it's all about the lead up to the Olympics. You have all of these athletes who are prospects who are probably going to do well in the Olympics, so you're following that. And then the games happen, you get really invested, and then all of a sudden the games are over. When the closing ceremonies are done, you already have the medal count, you know everything you need to know, and you move on with your life. You go back to normal life. It's like when people come back from a war. You have a day of celebration, and then the next day it's just back to work. And it's kind of cold for athletes, unfortunately, because the people right around them will be more celebratory, but your name usually just kind of disappears because you go back into whatever, unless you're like a basketball or baseball player, you just go back into doing whatever athletes do. And for most sports, there's just not much of a world after sports. So for sports cards, the tough part is the market for sports cards is before the Olympics have happened. So you don't even know who's going to win a medal, and it could be that all of the players who show, or all the athletes who show up in the card set aren't even going to medal. It's a really weird thing. Some names you just don't know yet because they haven't shown. In fact, when they select the athletes for the set, you don't even know if they're going to qualify for the Olympics. So it's really tough. But the other thing about 1992 was that in 1988, the card market was it was still in its infancy, essentially. There were only 4 companies. There was Topps, Fleer, Donruss, and Score was in its first year. We didn't even have Upper Deck or Pro Set or NBA Hoops. Topps hadn't made Bowman yet. So in 1988, there really wasn't much of a card market. People were buying a lot of cards, but there was no breadth. By 1992, it was totally different. I mean, football had over 10 companies making cards, and most of those companies they had more than one set, or at least half of them had more than one set that they were selling. The market was so much broader, and companies were running around all over trying to figure out new ways to capitalize on the popularity of sports cards. We even had a new area that Beckett liked to call future stars. And so card companies were trying to figure out what's the next new thing that nobody's tapped into that I can jump into and sell cards on. Well, guess what? Enter the Olympics. And when they entered in, we had 2 things going on, because one, we had the Olympics were evolving into a different existence in a market where it was prime and ready to really seize upon a more exciting Olympics. But the other thing that happened was, we had the Dream Team. And so that meant that this was a perfect environment to really capitalize on the new idea of making sports cards for Olympians. Now, the company that took up this sponsorship was a company called Impel. And Impel made like Disney cards, and they made novelty cards. But they were merging with Skybox, and so that meant that now they had a sports card wing as well. So they got two contracts, because the way the Olympics works is there's the U.S. Olympic team, and then each team within that has their own sponsorship deals. Like with the post office, they sponsor the cycling team. And so the Dream Team was a part of the U.S. basketball team, and the U.S. basketball team actually created their own logo for their uniforms that stood as their own. Impel could use it because they were Impel and Skybox, and they made a joint contract. So that meant that they could get the contract for the U.S. Olympic team, but they also had the Dream Team contract as well. So they had both of those, which was an important part of their ability to craft a sports card, to really take advantage of what the Olympics offered to them. So I'm not going to talk about the Dream Team cards, because I already did a video for that 3.5 years ago. And if you haven't seen that, I'm going to link it down below so you can watch it after this. Odds are you have watched it, because it's my second most popular video. But for this one, I'm just focusing on the Impel sets, which do have a couple of Dream Team players in it. But Impel was able to do the Olympics, and they were able to do the Dream Team both. And also, Skybox entirely covered the Dream Team, and then Impel entirely covered the U.S. Olympic team, and then, like I said, a little bit of the Dream Team, which we'll get to in a minute. So when they started off with a promo set, which was a 5-card set with a title card, looking at the 5 still then alive decathlon winners. And the decathlon is the gold standard for the Olympics. If there's one event or if there's one honor that determines the single greatest athlete, is the decathlon, because it's basically all the track events. It's the athlete who can do all of that the best. And so by 1992, it was still considered something that pretty much everybody knew about. And so the 5 decathlon winners, that were still alive, that were U.S. gold medalists, they did a set for each one of these athletes. And they wanted to do more of these. They actually advertised on this card, or on the title card, the checklist, that there would be more. I don't believe there were any. I think it was only the decathlon gold medalists. But the card that they created for it is a white border card with, down at the bottom, they have a little American flag-like logo that looks really cool. They have a wonderful chamfer off on the opposite side, where they have the player's name stuffed in there in a very dynamic and very avant-garde design for 1992. Among the most avant-garde card designs at this point, leading up to here. I mean, this is 1991. We didn't even have Ultra showing up in any significant fashion until 1992. So it was very bold and very, very forward-thinking. And then up at the top, they have that wonderfully intricate logo up at the top that just really looks great. The back, not so much, but that's okay. The front of these cards are amazing. It's a shame there are only 5 of them, though. So that was the preview set leading up to the first of their 2 sets. And Impel made 2 sets. They made a set in 1991 for the Hall of Fame, the Olympics Hall of Fame, and they made another set in 1992 for the Olympic hopefuls. The 91 design is a gray border with red, white, and blue stripes in the middle that have kind of a fabric look to them. And up at the top, they have another really wonderfully intricate design that says Hall of Fame. And then the middle of the card is usually a black and white shot from all of these legendary athletes, because that's what this is. This is looking back at the previous legends of the U.S. Olympic team, the history of the team. And the card back is, well, you don't have to really do much for card backs for these guys, because these athletes are in 1 or 2 Olympics, so you say a little bit about that, and that's about all you need to do. You don't need to break into stats, so the cards are a bit more simplistic than we normally see with sports cards. Now, there are a number of athletes that are truly legendary, And so we do get a couple of these names, and these are pretty famous names, whether it is Jesse Owens, Sugar Ray Leonard, or Bruce Jenner. But in saying there are a number of famous names, obviously of Jim Thorpe as well, but then you very quickly shift down to a second tier of athletes that are still quite famous, but not necessarily at the same level. So whether it's Wilma Rudolph or Mary Lou Retton or Scott Hamilton, there are a number of names that are kind of a second tier, names that for people who know what they're talking about, they're very common, but by this time a lot of these names are kind of fading. But most of the athletes are at a very lower tier than even that, where it kind of gives you a look into an area of sports that we don't really know much about because we rarely talk about the Olympics. So if you're looking for big names, the fact is there aren't a lot of big names in this card set, but it is a wonderful education on the history of the Olympics, primarily the US side of that. Now the images are they're normally just old images. There's nothing really all that exciting about them. They're usually pretty stock, until you get into the aquatic side, and then you get some really nice shots. I don't know if it's that they wanted to take advantage of the opportunity and so they put a little bit of extra effort into it, or if it's just that these shots just happen to be really eclectic. Regardless, there are a couple of cards in this set that really do stand out and look really good, most of them not so much. But they also, toward the end of the set, have a number of cards of, contributors. How often do you run into a card about a contributor? For the Olympics, that's extremely unusual, and so it really does show that this card set was trying to give you a full understanding of the history of the Olympics, which is an interesting idea for a card set. It makes sense in 1991, but it's not the kind of thing that we would expect after 1991. And then they have two sets of cards. Well, they're not quite subsets. They're series of cards that look at famous teams. The first one is the 1964 basketball team. And this was a really famous, this is probably one of the three most famous basketball teams in U.S. Olympics history. Obviously the Dream Team and then the 1996 women's team are probably the two most famous. 1964, though, this was kind of like the Miracle Mets for U.S. basketball. This team showed up and really surprised everybody, so they did a whole series of cards about the team. Individual cards and then the horizontal team card. But when I say individual cards, I'm talking about the series, not talking about any of the individual athletes. The other special subset or series is the other famous team from prior to the Dream Team, which is the 1980 U.S. men's hockey team. And here, it's done the same way. And if you're curious about how this situation worked out, because the U.S. did boycott the 1980 Olympics, well, they boycott the summer games, not the winter games. Because the way that it worked was they had the winter games in the beginning of the year, and then they had the opening ceremony midway through the year, and they had the summer games. And so that meant that the winter games were already over before you even started the traditional Olympics, and that happened year after year. So the U.S. showed up for the 1980 Winter Olympics, but by the time the Summer Olympics at Moscow came out, they said, nope, not interested. So that's why the basketball team didn't compete, but the hockey team did. And, well, it's pretty nice that the hockey team beat the Russian team, and it was almost kind of like a mic drop in a way, considering what would happen later on in the year. And then at the end of the set, they have a couple of kind of standalone cards. One of them is of distinctive achievements. So instead of looking at individual athletes, this talked more about distinctive achievements by the U.S. team itself overall. So kind of a cool card. And then they have a card that looks at all of the different Olympics. So it says what year, the location, and how many nations were involved. Now there are 3 Olympics that got skipped for very obvious reasons. There was one that was skipped because of World War I, and then 2 that were skipped because of World War II. And in case you're wondering, could they have still held it just with less countries? Well, let's see here. Okay, so in 1916, the games were supposed to be in Berlin. Yeah, maybe not. I think that one was probably not going to ever happen. But what about the other 2? Well, The Berlin Olympics did happen in 1936. That was over before World War II. So the 1940 Olympics was supposed to be in Tokyo. Okay, maybe not. What about 44? That was London. It's incredible that the three Olympics that were canceled because of the war were Berlin, London, and Tokyo. Really interesting for a games that is supposed to be about everybody coming together. It's pretty interesting. At any rate, that was the 1991 Olympics Hall of Fame set. So for 1992, now is time to do the hopeful set. That's what it was called. It was the Olympic cards, the U.S. hopefuls, or U.S. Olympics hopefuls. And so these are athletes who they're expected to make the Olympics, but there isn't even a guarantee that these athletes would, in fact, make the Olympics. Because you got to put the set together and then get it out on sale before you even have qualifying. So this is definitely kind of a reach in terms of who is in this set. And it means that a lot of the stars that we would know later on weren't necessarily in this card set. Now, the card itself, the design of the card is a white border, and that very much follows along with the promo cards, except instead of the chamfer down at the bottom, they have the full name and then the US logo in gold down at the bottom. Up at the top, they have a less intricate, but still kind of intricate logo for the Olympic cards set. And then in the middle, it's all about that image, even though the image is very much overpowered by the rest of the border of the card. It's a pretty heavy white border. On the back, though, they do have a really nice large image that shows up for the mugshot, which gives extra real estate for showing the athlete, because on the front, it's mostly action shots. So on the back is a good shot to get the ability to see the athlete, see what he or her looks like. Before I get into the athletes, though, there were two teams that were shown as teams. And the first one was the U.S. men's baseball team. There are a number of star players on here, like Jason Giambi is somewhere in this photo. The names are all listed on the back, but they don't have cards for any of the athletes themselves. It's just the team itself. A little bit different when you get to the basketball team, because the U.S. men's basketball team, the Dream Team, this is a team they wanted to celebrate because they had the contract, so they had the ability to put all of the players in. They did do one team card of all 10 of the original selected players. So Drexler and Leitner are not a part of this. But they did also do individual cards of each of the 10 members of the original allotment of the team. They also had a number of women's basketball players as well, which means these are among the first professional cards for women's basketball players ever done. Not a big list and not the biggest names that you're going to run into, but these cards are also added in here. And there are some fairly big names in this card set. So you have Oscar de la Hoya, you have Jim Courier, and you have Lance Armstrong, who of course is known entirely for his cycling history. And, well, once again, like with the previous set, there aren't a lot of really big names outside of this. Obviously the Dream Team was the big portion of the set, but again, there weren't a lot of athletes who were really at the true upper tier in terms of being legendary over a long period of time. And if there's one place there are two places in the Summer Olympics that are really significant: track and field and gymnastics. And to give you an idea of how lacking there is in terms of real star power, Shannon Miller is the only gymnast from the women's or men's team. Well, the men's team, I don't think anybody knows who the gymnasts are, but from both of the teams show up in the set almost equally. But Shannon Miller is the only significant name of all the members of the team. It really is surprising how limited it comes. But there's a lot more than just track and field, basketball, baseball, and the gymnastics team. It's surprising the broad range, and it's all done alphabetically. So each team it starts off with archery, and then baseball, and basketball, and on all the way through track and field out to the end. And some of the sports, you've got horse riding, you've got ping pong, which, yes, it's not table tennis, it is ping pong. and you have archery, and then you have sports like fencing and kayaking, and you even have windsurfing. I mean, it's pretty interesting to see the broad range of sports that show up here in the set. Now, once again, the aquatic shots do tend to be the most impressive, and it's for a good reason if you have really good photographers, which at the Olympics, obviously, you're going to have that. But it's fun to see some of these really cool images. But there's another trick up the aquatic sleeve, which is the fact that they also included synchronized swimming. And this is something that when I discovered this set, the ping pong that sport wasn't the one that surprised me. Synchronized swimming showing up here in this set is pretty interesting, especially considering that each one of these cards is an individual athlete. So that means that both women got their own card. But there's no way that we can have this discussion without talking about track and field. And the stars of track and field were pretty much limited to Michael Johnson, Gwen Torrence, and Mike Powell. Obviously, Michael Johnson is the big name amongst all these athletes. Gwen Torrence, I don't know how strong her name is, and Mike Powell, I think, is kind of a wisp in the background at this point. But those were the big track and field stars. And that essentially brings the set to a close. A couple of checklists, but that's pretty much it. Now, it is the Olympics, and so there's no way we can get through this without mentioning that there definitely was sponsorship. Coca-Cola was sponsoring this set release, and they were very gracious in offering us merchandise that we could we could buy as well. But you got to understand, this was associated with the U.S. Olympic team, and the U.S. Olympic team needed to continue to generate funds. So this card set was actually done as part of the fundraising for the team, which is why they did the merchandise here in this card set. This was actually supposed to be purchased while the Olympic team was still generating enough funds to cover all the costs of showing up in the Olympics. But they did do an insert. And the insert that they created for this card set was a hologram. Horizontal, it's a gold hologram, and it is the U.S. Olympic logo in front of a flag. That's what it is. On the back, it has the Olympic creed, and, well, that was literally the insert. Okay, they also included inserts in terms of they had autographs in packs. Now, these are cards that are no different than the regular cards in the set. They just happen to have an autograph on them, but the way that these cards were distinguished was that every single card is embossed with the U.S. Olympic logo right in the middle of the card. So that is the way that you can tell the official Olympic the official autographs from the packs, because these cards got autographed all the time, and most of the autographs out there are not from packs. The official ones from the packs do have a logo embossed in it. And that is the 1992 Olympics sets, both of the sets, well, 2.5 sets. And I'm going to be looking at 1996 in a separate video. I'm also going to do, this is kind of a part 2. I'm also going to do a video looking at the card sets that came before this, which is kind of haphazard. That's going to be a fun one to do. But here in 1992, this was what they did for the first official in-pack card sets for the Olympics. Now, if you have any questions about this, let me know in the comments below. There are probably some stories that you might want to talk about from remembering when you were following the Olympics and the names that popped up. Names like Kristi Yamaguchi didn't show up here because they didn't bother to include any of the Winter Olympics athletes because that wasn't a part of the upcoming Olympics. So a number of the athletes that we would have actually remembered didn't even get a chance to be in this card set. And I wish they did some more stuff for the Winter Olympics, but at any rate, this is what we got. So that's what I've got for this. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I do urge you to do so. Certainly check out my other videos, and thank you very much for watching.